Good evening, everyone. Oh, good evening, everyone. My co-chair, Dr. Bond, and I welcome you to the Arizona and the ACC Arizona chapter welcomes you to the 8th annual Women in Cardiology event. We are so excited to be back. We were not able to have this event last year, unfortunately, and prior, the event in 2019 had over 100 people. So this is one of our largest events, and we're so proud of that. It's such an amazing networking time, as well as a time to really inspire other men and women in our community as young as 12 and 13. So it's always been such an uplifting event. We've been working hard for the past few months to choose, as we diligently choose our amazing speakers. We go through many profiles, and Rachel and I really are just so excited to have three amazing women tonight that are going to address very, very important topics in our field. We want to also thank Shannon with J&J for helping us sponsor this event tonight, without whom it would not be possible, as well as Leanna and her team, who, of course, all these years, every year, continue to be dedicated to our Women in Cardiology event. It has been a pretty tough and long, almost 2 years through this pandemic. And I feel that the pandemic has really taught us more than ever to be grateful for the people around us. And I want to show much gratitude to all the men and women healthcare providers who have balanced their hectic careers, their children, their significant others, their patients, above all, with perseverance and without complaint. All of you, some of you are here with us tonight. Truly are heroes, and we thank you for your attendance tonight. We know that every minute with your family is important, and we appreciate the time you take. I always use this event, at the time of this event, it always reminds me of how we started. And we started this event, the inception was just 10 women feeling that we should have a forum to communicate issues. And we just got together in a room, and Dr. Noelle Berry-Mertz was one of our first speakers, and such a source of inspiration among all cardiologists, let alone just female cardiologists. And we really wanted to talk about issues that seemed to be taboo, and whether that was in fellowship or as attendings. And there were many issues that plagued our specialty that women did not feel included in the boys club, or did not obtain the same guidance and support as their male counterparts, whether they were fellows or whether it was a fellow attending relationship, what have you. Contracts were maybe unequal, and opportunities presented very differently among physicians. Mentorship was pretty scarce. And so we felt that these issues really don't get resolved unless we speak up and we address them. And so I'm so proud of how this event has morphed into a very large meeting, continuing to bring men and women together to open that dialogue, not only locally here in Phoenix, Scottsdale, and in our entire county, but nationally. This chapter has been recognized by National WIC for its outstanding perseverance. The chapter has inspired the opening of chapters not only in California, hopefully soon in Nevada, other ones in Georgia and Colorado as well. And tonight I want to thank the attendees who are located out of state, who are able to join this virtual event. So we are, again, very excited to have three amazing speakers. And I know that these women have not only excelled in their own careers, but they've helped other women along the way, which is one of the most important things for us. So I'll now hand it over to Dr. Bond to introduce our speakers tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Desai. And I just want to echo your sentiment around the fact we are so ecstatic we're able to do it this year. Last year, we did take a very brief break. Just before I introduce the speakers, I want to highlight the fact that COVID-19 has really placed a magnifying glass on a lot of disparities in care that we've been seeing. And one thing that I will say is that in order for us to make sure that we mitigate those disparities, we do need to diversify our field as cardiologists. So tonight, we're going to be addressing a lot of those particular topics, as Dr. Desai mentioned, that are rather taboo. And before we delve into those topics, I do want to introduce our wonderful speakers. So first, we have Dr. Sharon Hayes. Dr. Hayes is a professor of cardiovascular medicine and founded and maintains an active clinical practice in the Women's Heart Clinic at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. She additionally previously served as Mayo Clinic's first director of diversity and inclusion from 2010 through 2020. Additionally, she has been a founding member of Time's Up Healthcare and a tireless advocate for safe, equitable, and dignified healthcare workplaces that promote high-quality patient care and has developed programs to assess and mitigate unconscious bias in healthcare. In addition to this, she sits on several national committees and has done a series of national initiatives all centered around improving equity as well as gender disparities that we are highlighting, in addition to the research that she does most prominently on SCAD. Our second speaker is Juliette Burgess. Juliette is the founding attorney at the Burgess Law Group. She's been an active member of the Phoenix community and practicing labor and employment law and commercial litigation in Arizona for over 17 years. She was recognized by Southwest Super Lawyers as a rising star in the categories of employment defense and employment litigation in 2012, as well as 2013, as well as named Outstanding Women in Business by Phoenix Business Journal in 2020. Additionally, she was named Women Achiever of Arizona by the Arizona Capital Times, most recently in 2021. And she has ranked among the top labor and employment practices by Association Labor and Employment Law section of the Arizona Chapter Representatives, where she currently serves as on the membership as well as Executive Agency Outreach Committee. Our last speaker is Dr. Rebecca Chester, who is an interventional cardiologist at the Cardiovascular Institute. She joined the Cardiovascular Institute in 2020 with expertise in interventional cardiology, consultative cardiology, and women's cardiovascular health. Dr. Chester graduated from Tulane University School of Medicine in 2013 with honors and was inducted into the Alpha Omega Alpha Society. She completed her internal medicine residency at UCLA, as well as her cardiovascular fellowship at Mayo Clinic in Arizona. She returned to UCLA to complete her training in interventional cardiology with a focus on percutaneous coronary interventions. Additionally, she is board certified in echo and nuclear cardiology, and she's a proud mother and dedicated young female interventional cardiologist. With that, I'd love to give the floor to Dr. Hayes to start us off.
Thank you very much. And I want to make sure that my, can somebody give me a heads up and just say yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So tonight we have a relatively short time, which is good for those of you who are home with family and trying to manage everything. And so what I really want to do is tonight talk about sexual harassment. What is it? How prevalent is it? What types of environments perpetuate it? And I want to be solution focused. And so toward the end, we're going to talk about what is the role of individuals? What is the role of leaders, of organizations, of ACC perhaps? I have no disclosures. So let's start with a case. We've got Dr. Betty Hernandez. She is a junior faculty member at an academic medical center. She's one of 2 women in her division, and she's the only woman in the cath lab. The cath lab director and her primary mentor is Dr. Dylan James. The other guys, the other cath lab fellows and faculty socialize together, they work out together at the gym. They often discuss when together their cases and projects. And sometimes her colleagues fill her in, but usually to get the inside scoop, she has to ask. Off-color and sexually themed jokes and emails are commonly shared in the group, including with her. She's regularly introduced by Dr. Dillon as Betty and not Dr. Hernandez, and the men are all introduced as doctor in similar situations, and she's often assumed to be a member of the custodial staff or secretarial staff. She's less often assumed to be, she's less often included as a co-author in manuscripts, and she just doesn't have the same opportunities to learn and lead. One of the senior faculty members said he feels uncomfortable meeting with her in his office and won't mentor her, but he regularly meets with male colleagues and trainees there. On the other hand, Dr. James insists that they meet frequently, often off campus, sometimes over wine or a meal, and this makes her very uncomfortable. He's implied that if she doesn't, he'll need to take her off the project that she created and actually needs for future career opportunities. And then at an out of town ACC sponsored meeting, he insisted she join him for a drink in his hotel room. She got sick to avoid it. So Dr. Hernandez feels trapped, frightened, afraid to report her concerns, and she's really not sure how to navigate this. Oops, I am really sorry. I skipped ahead bunches of slides. I'm sorry, I'm going to close this out because I am actually having trouble. I am sorry, I had an issue with my PowerPoint. I am going to share it again. So are you able to see the PowerPoint now?
No,
I'm sorry.
you're fine.
Yeah. You would think after doing this for as many months as we have been doing that we would not have this problem. And I apologize. But I am trying to find the Zoom. I'm going to share over here.
Do you see the share screen?
I do now, and I am.
Dr. There we go. Perfect.
Would somebody else like to start? I am really, I feel like I have to go out of Zoom and come back in. Perhaps Dr. Burgess would like to speak and I will come back in. This has never happened to me before and I apologize. Great.
Absolutely. We see partially your screen, but I think it's a great idea to have Dr. Burgess go and then we'll try to figure this out on the back burner. Absolutely. So Dr. Burgess, are you?
And I'm going to stop my share.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Juliette Burgess, and I'm happy to go. I'm actually honored to be called Dr. Burgess because I'm sure that's a lawyer and not a doctor. So that's not a term I hear very often. And it's a privilege and an honor to be surrounded by such intelligent, incredible women.
Tonight, you're getting an honorary title, Juliette.
You know, I'm going to try to share my screen, and I actually am so relieved that somebody else had technological problems, because that is the one thing that I am not savvy with. So I'm glad I'm not the only one. So you guys tell me, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, awesome. I know we're tight on time, so I will just jump right in. Interestingly enough, when Sarika asked me to speak tonight, we actually didn't get into a lot of detail. And so I thought kind of for a while about what direction I could go in terms of what would be interesting to talk to women in cardiology about. And without knowing, that the speaker before me was going to talk about sexual harassment and some of the inequalities in the workplace. That's interestingly something that I found myself, but more on the contract side of things. So we are going to talk a little bit about women in cardiology getting equal pay for equal work. And just by way of really quick background, I am a labor and employment attorney. What that means is I handle anything that could come up in the workplace, ranging from employment agreements to severance agreements, employee handbooks and policies. I do a lot of harassment and sexual harassment prevention trainings. And as you would imagine with COVID, a lot of OSHA work, but everything ranging from wage and hour to Family Medical Leave Act, and all kinds of issues around hiring and firing and standard of conduct in the workplace. Because I know we have a lot of young women in cardiology with us tonight, I thought it might be interesting for me, just by way of further introduction, to also share my career path with you, because as you may or may not find it surprising, there are some similarities that are the simple truths of women in law as well as women in medicine. And they are that females are underpaid, females are underrepresented, and females are underestimated. So I started my practice at a big firm and was there for the first decade of my career. And after I had my second child, I have a son who's 11, a daughter who's 8, and then a daughter who actually just turned 1. After I had my second, I took a break from the practice and really, kind of divided and conquered with my husband and threw myself into being a mom, and felt very lucky to do it. And before I knew it, probably similarly to some of you, found myself volunteering on boards and in community service ways and using my law degree in unconventional ways. And through that work, I really formed relationships with community leaders and business leaders, which ended up encouraging me to start my own practice. And so flash forward a few years later, I have expanded beyond employment law, although that's still what I specialize in. And my practice group has 5 other attorneys, several contract attorneys, and a support staff, and we're growing. And it feels really great to be able to practice in a way that allows me to also have a family and have flexibility, but also use my law degree and empower other women. So I share that with you just as a quick side note to the topic we're talking about, because I hope that as women in medicine, if there ever comes a point where you feel like there's a fork in the road and you choose to put your family first, or maybe take an alternative career path, that you know that it's a chapter in your book. It's not necessarily your whole story, and that you are in control and you can write your way back however you want. And I think that it's a perfect segue into this topic because, as someone mentioned earlier, females are without a question disproportionately impacted by caregiver responsibilities. We're also 100% have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And as all of the HR research in my world talks about, is what we're calling the she-cession, right? More and more women have left the workplace than ever before. Females are also less likely to ask for higher compensation at the time of hire, or for raises or promotions once they are employed. Although ironically, the studies show both female lawyers and physicians actually spend more time with their patients and their clients, even though they're paid less. So I knew I was talking to a group of intelligent, fact-based doctors tonight. I did a little research, and I don't know how many of you have had a chance to see this survey, but I found it really interesting. This was done by Medscape in 2020. They surveyed over 17,000 physicians from over 30 specialties, and what they found, and actually this is during the height of the pandemic, right? So October 2019 to 2020. And then they weighted the response based on the American Medical Association's distribution of gender and other demographical factors. But on average, female specialists earn an average of about 31% less than male specialists. Although the good news is that cardiologists ranked better. They were only 16% less. So that's the good news. Of the bad news. Some of the other additional findings that I thought were interesting that I wanted to share with you just by way of introduction are that on average, the females that are based in a solo practice and solo office-based practice had the highest compensation as compared to females in an outpatient setting. And also interestingly, the average in compensation between women and men was the widest at 34 and younger, and then got progressively smaller with age. I know we're running tight on time, so I want to get to what I'm here to talk about. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but not surprisingly, the men and women felt differently about their compensations, right? Over 63% of the men felt they had been treated, felt that their compensation was fair, whereas only about half of the women did, which makes sense since they're being paid less than their male counterpoints. They shouldn't feel that it's fair. Another recent case that I thought was incredibly on point tonight that I don't know how many of you have heard about, but in October of 2020, Yale University actually settled a dispute with the US Department of Labor for underpaying female cardiologists. And I thought this was a perfect segue because I'll explain to you how this happened and what that means for you in terms of your contract negotiations, hopefully going into them. But to make a very long investigation shorter, during a routine compliance review, the Department of Labor found that 4 female cardiologists had been paid less than male faculty members during the 2016 to 2017 fiscal year. And so they ended up paying out about $87,000 in back pay and interest to these women. 2 of the female physicians were paid $27,500. One of them was paid about $20,000, and one of them received just over $12,000. And what can we kind of take away from this? First of all, this is real money. These are not trivial amounts. We're not talking about nickels and dimes and minimum wage. This is real money. Second of all, these amounts would have been compounded over time and would have expanded to be even bigger numbers as percentage raises proportionately went on had this not been corrected. And how does this happen, right? So this happens in law, it happens in all different industries for two reasons. One, well, for several reasons, but in this case, one of them was because the 4 women employees were hired when the Yale New Haven health system acquired the practices that they were working in. And so the practice compensation structures that were part of their initial contracts were carried over. And that's why their settlements, they were entitled to settlements they were, because their compensation was based on their previous contract arrangements. And just like other private employers, the university doesn't publish to their faculty and their staff what the pay is. So these female cardiologists had no frame of reference to know how their compensation compared to others in their field until this was done. So what does this mean? And again, I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to try to go through these 3 points quickly for you. These are kind of the 3 things that when I review contracts for physicians, not just cardiologists, but all physicians, are the things that we talk about the most on the front end, and the things that if we don't talk about them on the front end seem to come up on the back end the most. And so the first is compensation, and this is directly tied to what we're talking about. Whenever we get these offer letters or these contracts, they always have compensation. There's usually a base salary for you all. Ask, is there a salary range for this position? Where am I in this range? Ask these hard questions up front. What is this determination based on? Is it commensurate with experience? If you're brought to the practice through a contact, ask them the hard, awkward question of what they started at or what they're making, so you have a frame of reference going in. A lot of times there's also the fringe benefits, right? Paid time off or vacation, paid sick time that you're entitled to under Arizona law. Usually they'll cover your continuing medical education fees, professional fees. Sometimes there are relocation expenses. And other sign-on bonuses. Be careful with those. There's a lot of times a clawback provision, which is okay, but you just want to know that you're agreeing to it, meaning that if you leave, or if you leave within a certain period of time, you have to pay that money back. And so you want to be mindful of that and know it on the front end if you're agreeing to it. And then the other interesting thing to think about, a lot of times I see these bonus arrangements, and sometimes they're set amounts, right? If you're a retention bonus, if you're here for so long, you get so much. Sometimes if you take on lab work or radiology work, or you're doing leadership roles, there's a set bonus structure. But other times they're kind of incentive bonuses based on meeting targets, right? How many patients you see in a certain number of a set period of time, things like that. And so you want to kind of do that math before you agree to something to know what you're signing on to compensation wise. And again, we're going through this so fast, you could talk for days about each of these topics. But the other really important thing that comes up all the time with physicians are restrictive covenants. And this is what people call non-competes a lot of times. So restrictive covenants, you know, it sounds like a great deal. People are so excited, especially young doctors coming out of medical school, and they agree to these really stringent requirements. So the idea is that while you're employed and for a period of time after you're employed, you're agreeing not to do certain things. So a non-compete is saying you're not going to engage in a competitive activity with the practice that is hiring you. A non-solicit sometimes is written that you won't solicit patients, sometimes written that you won't solicit the employees of the practice. And then usually there's some type of non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality provisions as well. Interestingly, we also see a lot of restrictions on outside activities in your world. Sometimes you're not allowed to serve on a board or do other medical related activities without prior agreement of the people that you're working with or for. Again, a lot of this is okay, but you need to understand on the front end what you're agreeing to. Because sometimes you're limiting other ways that you may be able to make money by speaking or writing articles or doing other things. Restrictive covenants in general are disfavored under the law. The rules about them are specific for each state. So you want to look at the governing law or the choice of law and see which state applies. If it's Arizona, you're going to, there's kind of 3 rules in terms of when the court will find them enforceable. They need to be reasonable in duration, they need to be reasonable in geographic scope, and they need to be narrowly tailored to protect a legitimate business interest. Generally speaking, reasonable duration is 12 months or less. Generally speaking, geographic scope, the cases are found 50 miles or less, but it is case specific and industry specific. And then Arizona is what we call a blue pencil state, meaning that a lot of times these agreements will have step down provisions in them. So the court won't rewrite the agreement for the parties, but if they have a step down provision, so 12 months, but if 12 months is not enforceable, then 6 months. If 6 months is not enforceable, then 3 months. The court can blue pencil and cross out what is overbroad and leave in a portion of the agreement. So a lot of times we'll see them written that way as well. And then the last provision that is very important to know about and to read with careful eyes or with legal counsel are the term and termination provisions. So usually you get these contracts and they're either you don't have a set term, it's an at-will contract, meaning you can be hired or fired, you can quit or resign at any time, at any reason, with or without cause, or it's for a set period of time. So if it's a set period of time, we look at what's that initial term, and what are the automatic renewals for successive terms. Now here too is a place where women could negotiate for more, so that if they're renewing for a second term, they get an automatic raise, right? Also, a lot of times in these agreements, what is required to terminate the agreement is different for the employer versus the employee. So a lot of times they can do it without notice, but you need to give them 3 months or 2 months. So you want to read those carefully. A lot of times compensation wise, there's a distinction between when you're terminated for cause or without cause. And usually I recommend that we add language for good reason. So if you're terminating the agreement because you're being asked to relocate, or because you're now reporting to somebody other than who you were initially reporting to, or your compensation was reduced, or you weren't paid something you're supposed to be paid and you gave them notice and they didn't fix the breach, that you can resign with good reason and still get the severance agreement, even though you're not being terminated, you're resigning. And then also, as we saw in that Yale case, you want to make sure there's a provision that addresses what happens if there's a change in control of the group, right? If the practice is sold or acquired, or there's a merger, what does that mean for you and your compensation and your employment and how long you're going to be there? Is there, and usually there is an automatic termination for death or disability, but you want to read those provisions carefully. And I think we talked about it a little bit, that a lot of times there is pre-agreed to a pre-agreed to severance agreement, which kind of goes with the employment agreement, and it's conditioned upon whether you're terminated for cause or you're resigned with good reason. So again, I know you have two other great speakers to hear. I'm going to recap and review really quick, and I'll pass the torch. But my takeaways from tonight are that female cardiologists are statistically paid less than men. Advocate for yourself, negotiate more upfront, read the details, pay special attention to the key provisions that we talked about: compensation, restrictive covenants, which you may know as non-competes or non-solicits, and term and termination provisions. Ask the hard questions. Know what happens if X happens. Know what happens if the practice is sold. Know what happens if you want to go work for a competitor. What do you have to do? What permissions do you have to get? Can you do it? When can you do it? Ask that up front. And don't take, a lot of times we hear, oh, this is how they do it at X hospital, or this is how they do it at X practice. Don't take anyone's word for it. Read it yourself. And you know, if you need to, seek legal help to review these agreements and non-competition agreements. Thank you guys. You've been great to talk to, and I'm here to answer any questions if you have time after the other speakers go.
Thank you, Juliet. That was absolutely amazing. I think you're gonna be getting a lot of calls. That was extremely helpful information. I think all of us need to know that. I know even when I was a new grad or that last year of fellowship, when you're seeking a job, it just all seems so overwhelming, and it is best to get an attorney to review those contracts because the language alone is non-medical. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. So let's see now. Dr. Hayes, are we back on? Okay.
And
Don't
I'm
worry, I
very
know
sorry.
it's all, I'm technologically challenged. So.
Well, it was like something had taken over my machine. I was hitting forward, backward, and it was going forward. But I am hoping, I am bringing us back to Betty Hernandez.
All right, we're back. Go ahead.
So remember, she's in the cath lab, and the boss is kind of a predator. She feels trapped, and honestly, she is not sure that she has taken the right career path. So I just want to frame this because I think that regardless of your specialty, but certainly in cardiology, the vast majority of women and minoritized individuals have experienced a wide range of things, whether it's feeling isolated and excluded, lack of supportive mentors, more office housework or non-promotable work than others, mistreatment by allied health professionals and patients. But we're going to talk about the discrimination and harassment tonight because particularly sexual harassment. In 2018, a really important report, and I do not expect you to read this hundreds of pages, but it was really helpful to me to frame things for my leadership in talking about what is sexual harassment. So I think we all would agree that unwanted sexual attention and sexual coercion, that's the public perception. Most of us would all agree that's harassment. You know, asking a subordinate to come to their hotel room and have a drink, that's harassment. But there's just a lot of other types of things that go along with it that are like gender harassment, maybe not sexual harassment, but these are the environment that breeds sexual harassment. And so Dr. Hernandez is also in that environment where there's sexist remarks, sexy jokes, emails that are off color. And some of these, in some areas, and particularly in the sciences, might even be sabotaging women's work, you know, doing something in her lab or doing something in her practice, her equipment. So these are all part and parcel, even though they may not come out to sexual harassment. And then we've got the whole level of gender discrimination. So this was just published literally last week by Dr. Hannah Valentine, who is a cardiologist. She was a cardiologist for many years at Stanford and then took and became the first director of diversity and inclusion for the workforce at NIH. So she started that office. She did a lot. I think she's an impressive individual and has become a friend of mine. But they basically did a survey, a climate assessment of the NIH. So we think the NIH should be great, right? 1 in 5 of individuals who responded, and this was a 44% response rate. So about 7,000 people responded. In the past 12 months, 20%. Highest among women, sexual and gender minorities, trainees, students, people with disabilities, and the younger you were, the more you were vulnerable. More than half never told anyone. Not only didn't report it to their uppers, they didn't even tell their best friend. They did not talk to anyone about it. But those who were harassed because of the climate and because of their vulnerabilities also experienced more incivility, bullying, intimidating behaviors, and had repercussions in the workplace. So some of the organizational risk factors for sexual harassment are few women, a sexist climate, low psychological safety. Think about Dr. Hernandez, identity-based harassment, unsupportive supervisors, a toxic leadership. So it comes down to the climate and culture. So this was identified by the NASM report as risk factors. And I think one of the things that I've taken away through my readings about this is how many features of cardiology actually fit with these high risk factor environments, which is why we need to change it. And I think the other thing we've just heard talk about equity in payment or in compensation. And it's important to note that sexual harassment typically doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because the system supports one of inequity, whether it's compensation, promotion, opportunity, or leadership. And so that often is where the problem lies. Our colleague, Dr. Garima Sharma, put together and led this project, which looked at a global cardiology workforce and basically focused on the environment. It was not specifically to look at sexual harassment, but the hostile workforce. There really hasn't been much about cardiology that has been published, which is why I bring this forward. But I think what we see is that a hostile workplace was sexual harassment was much more common among women. And the types of sexual harassment were both remarks, inappropriate remarks, touching. It made up almost half of the experience, including threats and forced sexual behavior. And again, about half of those who had sexual harassment had more than one type of sexual harassment. The toll was high because these individuals had impact on their patient care as well as relationships with their patients. So this was a study which, although it's not cardiology, if you think about surgical residents at the end of their training, they have a lot in common with cardiology fellows at the end of their training. And they have an in-service exam and they ask them all to stay and take this survey. And the response rate was like 92%. So over 7,000, and about a third were women. So very similar to the makeup of the cardiology workforce. And I think what's important is that 70% of women had some type of gender-based harassment. And among sexual harassment, the source among women was from patients and patients' families, as much as it was from attending surgeons. That's really important takeaway. And there have been several papers that have come out of this survey. For gender discrimination, which affected 2/3 of women, the source among women, half of that was from patients and families and a quarter from nurses and staff, less than attending surgeons. So I think it's important when we are talking about sexual harassment, it isn't just what goes on about the mentor, it is embedded in many areas in which we practice and are. So here's another scenario. Female fellows, male inpatient, became more sexually provocative each day on pre-rounds when she was alone in the room with her. She didn't mention it to the team because she thought she should be able to deal with it on her own. So to ensure that it wasn't her fault, that she wasn't giving off some kind of vibes that this behavior was okay, or that she was interested, she intentionally assumed a more formal demeanor with the patient and told him that his behavior made her feel uncomfortable and that he needed to stop. So during team rounds, later that day, the patient demanded to be reassigned to a different trainee. The attending just agreed, assigned a male fellow to the patient, no discussion with the team or the targeted fellow. So you can imagine that she felt humiliated, unsupported, ashamed, and not safe. And so I think that's the other part of this is when these behaviors are going on, it's hard to feel safe physically and emotionally, and it's hard to learn, teach, lead, care for patients, and possibly to stay in our work. That's why this is so important, because sexual harassment, we need to reframe this. It's not, it's not something that isn't, it is framing it as a severe occupational hazard analogous to other workforce dangers. And that's what the NASM report did. It's research misconduct. So if it happens in the research lab, it actually would be considered as research conduct, and it can lead to adverse patient outcomes. So I've talked about sexual harassment. It's pervasive. It comes from patients. It comes from coworkers. It may be worse in cardiology than some other fields. But often the conversation is, well, let's equip women with resources. Let's make her more resilient. Let's have her behave differently. And I think my point today to this audience of women is to stop fixing women, because women are doing their part. And this sexual harassment, gender bias in medicine and in cardiology needs to be up here at a systemic level. So going back to our fellow, which bystander response should she have wanted? Patient asks you to join him in his bed. The attending says, that's not in her job description. And what she hears is just get over it, take care of the patient. But what if that attending said, we aren't going to continue to care for you if you can't respect our trainees? You hear, that behavior is inappropriate, won't be tolerated. I am supported by my team and organization. And the reason I point this out is often when we as leaders, the attendings on the roll, the bystander, we are so taken aback by this behavior that we're caught flat-footed. And so one of the things that we can do is learn to be upstanders, and leaders serve a critical role as trusted first responders. And some of you may say, well, I'm just a cardiologist. In fact, I'm a junior cardiologist. I'm not a leader. I can tell you that every physician is viewed as a leader by their team, by the patients, by the nurses, by the allied health staff. And when we don't act, then even if we're not feeling very leader-like or very powerful, that is tacit approval of the behavior. And our trainees and employees don't speak out because they don't want to be singled out or blamed. They feel isolated, particularly if it happens in the middle of the night, that maybe they won't be believed. And honestly, some of them have said, why should I report this? Because I've watched other people be dismissed when they did or mentioned it. So empowering upstanders as opposed to bystanders, and that may be you, is really important. So teaching people how to intervene and not be silent, and having a few scripts that you can step in to stop the behavior, or to realize this is a mandatory reporting, I need to lift this up. Support and safety is critical for the target or victim. They must be, you have to have a policy in your organization, whether you're a private practice or you're a big organization like Mayo Clinic. Having a policy, procedure, reporting structure, and consistent application of rules is really important. And for Title IX, I say that because Title IX, when you have learners, medical students, residents, GME, that is covered by a whole different set of rules, including the fact that if some trainee comes to you and tells you about something that happens, you are obliged to report it to your organization. And that's way too much to go in today, but I think knowing if you have learners in your environment, what your obligations are. So one of the things, I'll tell you just a little story, because these are things that your organization could do. So back when Me Too came out back in 2017, we said, I was director of diversity and inclusion, and we said, well, how's Mayo doing? Well, we realized we were falling short. And we went through a period of discernment. We reviewed our policies, and we have published sort of the outcomes of this if you're interested. But first of all, we looked at our policies, and we wanted to make sure they were updated, that they addressed sexual harassment directly. We also needed a procedure to investigate them, and we didn't. What we found is that across our enterprise, and we're in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, that depending on the department, the reporter, and who it came to, people were being treated differently, where some got a slap on the wrist and others were being terminated. And we realized that we needed to own that. We created a team. We followed the law, and it was different in different states. We engaged our senior leadership who were very supportive. Just culture is a description of when you apply a punishment that fits the crime. So somebody who does something that maybe is a little, is telling off-color jokes repeatedly, coming in and coaching that individual as a first step might be the most appropriate thing. Whereas if somebody has, like Dr. Dillon with Betty Hernandez, may require either termination or significant sanctions because of the action and the power differential. The other thing we did is we trained and educated all of our staff. And don't roll your eyes. Mandatory training is often something that none of us wants to sit through. But I will tell you, we were successful in training 67,000 employees with at least the baseline of what is expected behavior and how to report. And what we found, because we're collecting the data, is that we've been doing this for a number of years. We have a dashboard. We also know that the vast majority of those who were perpetuating this had a power differential. It was much more the fact that it was male physicians, which is a minority of the workforce, but had an outsized influence. And so that allows us to target education and support for those individuals. So this is a complex problem, requires a system solution. We have to acknowledge that this is a problem. And honestly, we know that in some of our organizations, people don't think it's a problem. It is. Leadership must drive the change. And that's the people you work with nationally, including ACC. We need to address the internal and external organizational structures that perpetuate gender inequity, like compensation, hostile climates, perceptions, the lack of diversity. Our organizations need to take an aggressive stance and a transparent process. And that includes not passing the harasser. One of the concerns that there is so say you fire somebody, but there's some kind of gag order, so they go out on the job market and all of a sudden they are working at another organization. So it's really important we be transparent and that you don't have non-disclosure agreements for these types of things. And then really importantly, providing training for upstander behavior response, because everyone can learn some of that. So sexual harassment and gender discrimination, it's pervasive, causes physical and psychological and financial harm. It drives people from the profession and must be addressed. So thank you very much, and apologies for the earlier technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayes. I'm sure we'll have a series of questions later on in the course. So I'm going to turn it now to Dr. Chester, who as well as a Mayo graduate. And if you don't mind, hopefully you'll be able to share your screen for us as well.
Let's see. All right, so I'll share and then let me put it in presenter mode. How are we doing?
We are good.
Okay, well, thank you so much, you guys, for having me come talk tonight. It's been wonderful hearing the previous speakers. I loved what Dr. Burgess, we're going to keep you with that honorary title, had to say with her a kind of career path with the alternative timeline. I mean, obviously she's achieved great success and she didn't necessarily feel constrained by a traditional timeline along her career. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. So that was a great example in the real world on how you can do that. Also, thanks, Dr. Hayes. Those are amazing tools for improving the workplace environment for women. So thank you so much. Well, you heard a little bit about my bio on who I am. I will tell you, I am no formal expert in work-life balance, but I am an interventional cardiologist and I have 3 children under the age of 4. So hopefully I have some tools and tricks and some perspective that'll be helpful to others out there as they balance this work and mommy business. It's kind of funny. Today was a rather hectic day for all of this in my own personal life. So I was kind of chuckling to myself that I was giving a talk on work-life balance later this evening. But at the end of the day, everyone's doing great. So that's what matters. So this phrase of work-life balance, I'll say, there's a problem in how we even state this to begin with. First, it assumes that life only occurs when we're not at work, and that life is good and work is bad. And this encourages us to segment our work and our life. And it can feel that way, like the only solution to work-life balance is to reduce your hours, but that may or may not actually help you achieve your goals. And why is this important to physicians? Well, you probably have all heard that physicians need to be able, affable, and available. And that available can be a really big challenge when you're balancing having a work and life. And this availability doesn't just mean the hours that you're working during the day. Most of us are available by phone 24/7. And so some boundaries can be important to figure out how to implement. And cardiologists on average work 57 hours a week. And I know that's a gross underestimation for some people, but it's a long job. There's a lot of work that goes into it. At the end of the day, though, medicine is a profession. And so when you're passionate about your work, it can be easy to neglect other aspects of your life. But on the other hand, we all derive great joy and purpose from our work. And so to have work be the bad thing that you're doing that's kind of taking away from the work-life balance doesn't really fit. The final thing is that a lot of the intense years of training and responsibility in medicine are going to coincide with important periods of your life, like getting married, having children, raising those children. And so this is really critical for women to balance how they're going to achieve their goals in their personal and professional life. I think this is kind of funny, this idea of wellness. So this is really hot topic of trying to prevent burnout and achieve wellness. And whenever I hear about these things, I feel like I end up with this really long to-do list of all of these things that I'm supposed to do in addition to all the work that I'm already doing. So to achieve wellness, we're supposed to do all of these things listed here in these bubbles. And the purpose is supposed to have us be a little bit more zen and happy, but it can make you feel like it's just more stuff that you're trying to accomplish. And the way that most people, well, I hope people approach this is that they realize they can't necessarily do every single one of these things every day, and they have to incorporate these things in small amounts in a way that works with their life. And I think work-life balance is similar to that. But a real point here is that I think you need to rephrase this as how do you find joy and purpose in your personal and professional life rather than how do you find work-life balance, because that's going to be very different for each person, and it's going to be different for an individual at different points in their life as well. A really important strategy that I feel like I kind of figured out in my own life and then realized it's been described more formally is this concept of counterbalancing. And what this is, well, where this comes from is a book, The One Thing, The Surprisingly Simple Truth Behind Extraordinary Results from Gary Keller, and described in this setting very well in Mayo Clinic proceedings as noted below. And what this really shows is that we have 168 hours in a week, and that's the time that we have to accomplish all of the things we're trying to do. And so you have these sliders that you can move along with different components in your life. There's your work, yourself, and other important people in your life. And we are realizing that when you're moving these sliders, what you're hoping to accomplish is that you never shift so far towards one of those individual components that you can't find your way back, or that when you do find your way back, there's something left for you there. And when you shift these sliders, each shift will come at the expense or benefit of another component. So for instance, you have this first week, that's a normal week. You're working here about 60 hours. You've got some personal time, you've got some time for others. And then I'll just kind of shift down to this as this is the most relevant for us in our field. You might have a week that you're on hospital service, or you have a grant deadline or some intense period of work where your time is shifted heavily towards work. And you realize that these individual components in your life can handle temporary imbalances because you might schedule a vacation or a time of lighter work after that to counterbalance back towards yourself and the other important people in your life, so that you never find that time where you've spent so much time with one component that you can't make it back to the others. So I think this is a very important concept, and I just want you to keep it in mind as I go through some of the other ideas that I have about work-life balance. For this presentation, I tried to organize my thoughts into 5 steps to achieving personal and professional joy. So the first step is you really need to identify goals, your short-term and your long-term goals within each component of your work, yourself, and others. And I encourage you to think about these short and long-term goals in as short a segment as what are my goals this week? And what are my goals this year? And what are my goals in 5 years and 10 years? Because it can help you organize your time. And here are some examples of goals that you might have in work for yourself and for others. And this is in my mind is a very critical step of identifying what your non-negotiables are. So what items in each of that list of goals in your work, yourself, and others are priorities? Which are the ones that are not open to compromise and which are the ones that are? And I did a little test whenever I kind of try to come up with these goals for myself. I do a test where I say, when I'm 80 years old, what am I going to look back on and regret? And it helps put everything in perspective. So, for instance, this morning, my house was a house of crying banshees. And just to get out the door, I was late to work and had to push back my first case by about 45 minutes, which feels like a terrible thing. But I tried to put it in perspective by realizing in a couple of years, even really a couple of weeks, no one's going to remember this at all. And so it really doesn't matter. And everyone got taken care of. This is also helpful when you're getting input from, say, mentors who may have different priorities in their life, or colleagues that have different priorities in their life, and they're trying to sway you in one way or another. It helps you come back to who are you and what is it in your life that you're trying to accomplish. And that, again, can help put things in perspective when you're trying to come up with your career plan. And finally, it's very important to involve important stakeholders such as your spouse, because if there are important people in your life that you're trying to achieve these goals with, you need to involve them. So here's a couple example timelines from what I set out as some of my goals. And here's my 5-10-year plan that I originally set out thinking about. And here's a week-long short-term goal schedule that I'm looking at and how I balance and counterbalance. So for instance, when I'm on STEMI call, say I'm on for the weekend, I might be on Thursday through Sunday. And those are some work responsibilities that I have to take. And in order to balance that week, I might realize, okay, this week I really need to do XYZ personal item. I have to get my teeth cleaned. I have to take care of myself. I'm going to make sure that since that's a non-negotiable to take care of my teeth, I'm going to have a dentist appointment and I'm going to make it there. I might have as an example, I really like to take my kids to the doctor. And so that to me is a non-negotiable. I might miss out on other time with them, but I want to be present for that. So I set out the week realizing this is something that has to happen, even if it comes at the expense that maybe the following day I have to work a little bit longer. And I really do actually take every week at a time sometimes and identify my non-negotiables that week and shift my schedule around to make sure that I'm finding that balance and counterbalance on a weekly basis to longer basis as well. This is the next step, I think, is getting on the same page. This is going back to your spouse and important people in your personal life. And you might come up with your non-negotiables, but you have to remember your spouse or partner, important family members are going to have their own non-negotiables. And so you need to sit down and really listen to what their important priority items for accomplishment are. And by you having gone through the process of identifying overall what your goals are and what your priority non-negotiables are, that opens you to say, okay, well, this item I can negotiate on. And that helps you work together more as a team so that you can both achieve your non-negotiable goals in the short term and the long term. And then there's this idea of sacrifice and giving important people the ability to say uncle. So what do I mean by this? I'll share an example. When I was applying for interventional cardiology fellowship, I had a young child. He was 2 when I started interventional fellowship, and I was pregnant. So I had a 6-week-old when I started my interventional fellowship. And I had to move my whole family from Arizona to California in order to do this. And so I had to really be on the same page with my husband because this was going to affect him. And so the way that we looked at it was, I really want to be an interventional cardiologist. It is not one of my non-negotiables. I'm not going to sacrifice my family for this, but I really want to make it work. And so one way I made it work is that I only applied to programs where my husband would be able to take a sabbatical and come with me with the kids. And I sat down with him and explained what the duty requirements were going to be. I was going to be on call every other day for a year. I really wasn't going to be very available. And I told him, if at any point you feel like this part of my life is sacrificing too much of the family, I give you the right to call uncle and say, we can't do this anymore. And I will hear that, respect that, and I will change my plans because we've already talked and realized it's something I want, but it's not a non-negotiable. And fortunately, he never did that. But I think that upfront, letting him know that he and the family were the priority and I would listen to them if they told me there was a big problem, made them feel more like they were supporting me in my career goals rather than being dragged along. And that was a really important kind of life lesson that I learned when going through this process. This kind of goes along with what Dr. Burgess was saying with adjusting your timelines. So your life events might mean that you take longer to achieve the same goal compared to somebody else. And that's perfectly okay. So here's an example of my original long-term plan on goals that I was trying to achieve. And here's an alternative plan where someone might have life events, whether it's they want to take some time off to travel and augment their personal life, or they want to take a really long maternity leave, or they had something going on with their family where they really needed to pay some attention to a family issue. At the end of the day, they've still achieved all of their goals. They just achieved it at a different timeline, which is perfectly okay. And I think something you just need to realize is an option and acceptable. In addition, there's this idea of managing dual timelines. And I think Dr. Burgess also mentioned this, you kind of tag team. She tag teamed with her husband. That's an important idea too. When you have a 2-career household, how do you make everybody feel satisfied, like they can succeed in work and life? And so what you can do here is try to line up your timelines where you don't have everybody in a very intense period of work at the same time. So while one person might be writing a proposal or a grant, that other person's not on hospital call that entire month, or vice versa. And that way you have a little bit more balance where someone can take on more of the housework and the home life management while someone else gets an opportunity to focus on work, and then you switch. So no one feels like they're getting the short end of the stick. Finally, you always need to assess and reset. Every once in a while, stop and do a maintain, improve, and change test where you say, what about my life do I want to maintain? What do I want to improve? And what do I want to change? And avoid comparison to others' accomplishments. Everybody walks a different path. Everybody's needs and requirements are a little bit different. So you really need to avoid comparing yourself to others. And when life events occur, you might need to reassess. So at the completion of training, marriage, childbirth, death of a loved one, you might need to sit down and say, how does this change my short and long-term goals? What are my priorities and non-negotiables now? And how can I adjust my timeline so that I can achieve all these things and give the attention that is needed to my personal life? Out of all of this, there are a couple additional tools that you can use in your work and life. Number one is prepare individuals for periods of intense work and plan a counterbalance. So as an example, when I'm on STEMI call, I always explain to my kids that mom's here, mom might need to leave at the drop of a hat. And if she does, it's because there's an emergency and someone might die and I'm going to go fix their heart. And with this, it actually sparked a lot of conversations with my young kids. And by the end of my interventional fellowship, my son could walk you through a radial cath by the end of the year. And whenever I had to leave, they were okay with it. And when I came back, they wanted to see the angiograms and hear about what happened. Likewise, when I was on call for a long period of time, or if I had to spend a lot of time at work, I usually plan some time with my family where I can really pay attention to them and be present and focused. And that helps balance in our household. There's also the idea of time management. So we have those 168 hours a week. You don't have time to be doing superfluous activities. And so when you've identified your non-negotiable goals, that again puts things in perspective and can help you say, this project or activity that somebody else wants me to do either does or does not help me achieve those really important goals. And that's going to help me decide if I'm going to say yes or no, and learn to say no. If it doesn't help you achieve your goals, it's just wasting your time. You don't necessarily need to do it. Outsourcing work is also important. I've heard the saying, if it doesn't require love, hire help. There's so much to do at home. So if you have the resources to hire a housekeeper, a nanny, or whatever it is that is taking up time in your life and detracting from you achieving your personal and professional goals, if you have the ability to hire help, do it. And in some cases, you may need to reduce hours. So as another example, a friend of mine is an allergist, and she's married to an orthopedic surgeon. And so you can imagine their life is very busy. And one of her non-negotiables was she really wanted to be present for her children in a way that was important for her. She wanted to go do all the drop off, all the pickup. She wanted to be home for dinner every night. She wanted to put her kids to bed. She didn't want to hire anybody else to do that. And so she decided to go part-time. And that was the balance that worked for her to achieve her personal and professional goals. It sounds lovely and it works for her. But then, as an example in my life, I get so much joy from my job. I don't think I'd be happy with that. And both of those plans are okay. But you'll be comfortable with it if you have identified what's important to you so that you can schedule your work and life around that. And then finally, the tool of reassessment and resetting that I mentioned. When you have changing life events, you need to do that maintain, improve, and change test, and maybe reassess your short and long-term goals and plan accordingly. So here's just a little personal reflection on what I had set out to do and what I have achieved. And I'm still early career. I'm just starting my second year in private practice. So I have lots of opportunity to achieve my new goals, which I have to start setting, in fact. So my original goals were I wanted to go to medical school. I wanted to do general cardiology. I would love to do interventional cardiology and work at an academic center where I achieve academic rank and have the opportunity to teach. I had several hobbies, mostly related to sports with running, martial arts, etc. And I wanted to get married, have a healthy marriage, and have children. So I met my husband before medical school, and I knew that medical school and general cardiology were non-negotiables for me. And so when I got into medical school and had to leave town, it was a hard time for our relationship, and we had to decide what to do. And I really realized that if someone was going to ask me not to go to medical school to stay put, it wasn't going to be a good fit. I would lose and sacrifice too much of myself. And because of that, we ended up in a long distance relationship for 7 years through medical school and residency, because those non-negotiable goals for my work were the most important thing. And I couldn't sacrifice those and be happy with my life. Towards the end of residency, I realized we were getting to the point that I needed to have a healthier marriage and I needed to have children. I wanted to actually live with my husband. And it was a difficult time where lots of mentors were telling me I was going to shoot myself in the foot by leaving my institution. I wasn't going to achieve academic rank if I left, and nobody wanted me to leave. And I made the decision to leave my program, move to Arizona so I could live with my husband and start a family, because those were my non-negotiables. And I achieved all of those things, which was great. I discussed a little bit about how I went about achieving my goal of interventional cardiology and how I balanced that with my healthy marriage and family. And that's worked out great. And I have been able to maintain some of my hobbies, but as I was making this presentation, I realized these days, most of my hobbies are related to my kids, but that's perfectly fine. And at this point in my life, I've achieved in so many of the things that I set out to do. I've balanced things well, and now I get the opportunity to assess and set my next goals, and look at my timeline and say, maybe I'll do things in a little bit different timeline, and all of that's okay. And I am maintaining that balance of joy in my personal and professional life. And finally, here are just some pictures of me in my two happy places, the cath lab and at home with my family. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation. I think we'll have some time for questions, so I'd be happy to take some at the end. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Becca. That was amazing. And I'm reminded that it does take a village. Whether it's through your parents, your spouse, your children. That was really, really wonderful. I think in cardiology, particularly, we bow our heads and we never say no. And I'm guilty as I'm responding to texts from patients and such as I'm listening to you. And but you have to draw boundaries. You have to draw boundaries. And you've certainly done marvelous. And you're an example for, even though you're young in your career, you're such an example for all of us. So we wish you much luck and, thank you. Thank you for that presentation.
Oh, thank you guys.
Okay. Rachel, Liana, shall we open it up to questions? Okay, let's see.
While you're looking for questions, can I just make a comment about Dr. Chester's presentation? So it was brilliant, but also as somebody who's been through all of that and has some perspective looking back, I think for those of you who are participating who are earlier career and think you have to get it all done at once, think of the career arc that we have. We have had excellent training. We have had many things. And I was a late bloomer. I wasn't a full professor till I was in my 50s in an academic place where I trained many of the men who were professors before me. But you can have a really rich career and you can have it all and you can just space it out a bit. And I do think that academic medicine and medicine in general often makes everything seem urgent and makes us feel failures if we don't reach certain milestones. And I think Dr. Chester's presentation, the way she thinks about things is brilliant. You can think about it however you want, but I'm just here to remind you that slow and steady wins the race. I'm still here, so.
Can I just piggyback on something that Dr. Hayes just said? I couldn't agree more. I thought that your presentation was amazing and I was taking copious notes, and I'm going to be getting those books on Amazon tonight, along with like the 4 other Brene Brown books that I have in my cart that I need to read about imperfection, being brave, not perfect. I think I'm in good company. I never realized how much, how similarly women in law are to women in medicine, but I found it really insightful. And one of the things that Dr. Hayes said that, resonates with me as well, is I think if, she said slow and steady. I think if you can find a way to keep one foot in the door, because it was the same thing with me, when I sort of, same thing, negotiables, deciding what to prioritize and something having to give and burning the candle on all the ends and choosing my family at some point. I had all these mentors who said the same kind of things to me in terms of, oh my goodness, my wife stopped working when we had children and she never got back, or, just be careful. If you let your license lapse, you'll never be able to practice again. And, they instilled the fear of God in me that I was really just never going to find my way back. And it was like 1 or 2 female friend mentors, really in different industries even, who kind of encouraged me, that said, even though you're going to take this time to focus on your family, join a board and stay involved in the community and use your law degree in an unconventional way. And then, it was another good contact client that said, we know you're not working, but will you just do this for us on a contract basis? And even though it meant, hustling while my kids were at preschool for 2 hours in the morning and staying up a little bit late and paying the babysitter to work for 2 hours instead of going to yoga or do other things, I did it just to keep a foot in the water. And it was enough that when I was ready to start swimming again, I had enough of a momentum and enough of contacts. And so I know you hear that all the time of leaning in, but my girlfriends and I like to say, just hang in. If you can just hang in, then you can kind of course correct and start swimming faster, like Dr. Hayes said, when you have more time.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that really goes back to that counterbalancing idea where you can shift your sliders and kind of shift your priorities over time, but you never want to go so far in one direction you can never find your way back if you do. And that's that keeping your foot in the door and having a little bit of activity. Don't let your license lapse, et cetera, so that you have those options. So absolutely agree.
And I would even say, in many of us who are in academic centers where there is a lot of pressure to publish And maybe when you were earlier pre-kids, you were first author, or maybe you had a couple of publications a year. And there's a real push, and there's a real tendency to just say, like, I just need to leave. I need to pull out altogether. And I think for those of you who are in academics is, so you can't be publishing 2 papers a year or more, but you can be middle author and make meaningful contributions to a couple every year for 10 years, and then you won't be forgotten. It's like Dr. Burgess said, you want to stay relevant and helpful, but realizing you can bloom later.
Yeah, and also I think an important point is it's some women don't want to have children, and that's okay too. And those are pressures that we as women face. And I think, to be married, to have children, and that whole aspect, and for some women that's not the plan, and that's okay too, and not to be criticized by your peers for that. So yeah, that was great. I think, thank you for all the feedback from Dr. Hayes and Dr. Burgess. It's just really, you're not a cardiologist now, you just are.
I mean, I think they technically, when you get your JD, they call it's a PhD. It's like a doctor, but I'm not usually called. So thank you. Very special.
Okay, so it looks like we have a question. Rachel, would you like to take it?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a question which seems to have a few parts to it. So the first part is, how do you plan to be efficient through the day and the week, taking care of yourself, your work, your family? And then subsequently, what has worked and not worked for you, and what do you wish you would have done differently with small children? I don't know if that was directed to you, Dr. Chester, but I'm sure all on the call can probably answer and weigh in if you want to get started.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, multiple parts to this, and I'm kind of in it because my oldest is in preschool. So let's see. One thing that I think I definitely learned with my 3 maternity leaves is that everyone talks about maternity leave when you're having children, and that's always the focus. But the first year is really the time that you need to be thinking about. There are a lot of illnesses that happen first year. And so being able to handle that can be very stressful. So my maternity leaves, I took 6 weeks for my first 2. That was just what was required for fellowship. I did not take any other vacation so that I could have time off when my kids were born and if anything came up. And with my 3rd child, I took 8 weeks. And I always tried to save time later. I didn't want to use up all of my time on maternity leave. Fortunately, I was healthy. I didn't have complications that I needed more time off. But that way I didn't feel guilty if I had to take time off for sick kids, or, hey, it's nice to go on vacation for your kid's first Christmas. So that was one thing that I liked. One thing that I did not like is that with my first child, I think I was racked with so much guilt that I had taken time off and I had all these goals I wanted to achieve. In the first 6 months of my son's life, I published like 3 papers, agreed to be the cardiology fellowship chief, and did everything. And unfortunately, my son had some health complications and he was hospitalized for a week in the ICU. Every month, every time he got a cold, he was in the ER. And I was really burning the candle at both ends. And I wish that at that point I had pulled back. I think that if I had, obviously hindsight is 2020. If I had the perspective that I had now, I would have slowed down my timeline and I would have reprioritized my goals and realized that I needed some more time at home during that period. I could probably talk forever about this, but I'll let some of the other panelists jump in as well.
I'm happy to chime in. The one thing that there's a book that I would recommend, and this was a book that when I came back from my first child to maternity leave to work full time, another lawyer gave to me. I was actually covering her cases while she was out on maternity leave, and then she gave it to me when I took mine and came back. And it was called Secrets of the Stay at Work Mom, and it was a dated book then, and it was from a used bookstore. So, but I'm sure you can find it on Amazon. And it was a very interesting book because it was essentially what we're doing tonight. It was written by a bunch of successful women in different industries. And they were each sharing kind of their secrets to success. And one of the things that I read in there, a couple of things that resonated with me and that I kind of, that have been really gotten me through. One of them was, you know, as working mothers and just women running households, a lot of times you feel like you're trying to do everything every day, right? So you're doing laundry all day, every day, especially while you're working remotely, and you're loading the dishwasher and you're ordering groceries and you're trying to work. And what she said was sort of, for her work week started on a Monday. I know it's different for you guys, but she said by Sunday night, all of the laundry for the household was done and in everybody's room, even if that meant outsourcing it and having somebody else do it. But she knew then that the children had their underwear, their pajamas, their clean socks to run for the week, and the nanny and her husband and whoever needed to could dress them and get them out the door. And I sort of subscribed to that when I first went back as a working mom, and I did my grocery shopping on Sundays, I did my laundry on Sundays, and that way when I started Monday, we had the supplies we needed to run for the week. And that system might look different for you, and that's okay, but I think having a system helps a lot. And I think also just giving yourself permission to tweak the system as you go. For me, I kind of had started to find my rhythm with 2 school-age children, and I would drop them off and work while they were at school and then pick them up and kind of be a mom in the afternoon and take them to their activities and then log on after they went to bed at night. And having a newborn this year, that schedule didn't work anymore, right? As Rebecca said, that first year of life is hard. And so I had to tweak it and get help in different departments to make it work. So give yourself, make a schedule, make a system, hire the right people, or delegate to other women in your life who you trust, who maybe want to have some responsibility, and let them take on different things that, like you said, don't touch your heart and that you can separate from, but then give yourself permission to tweak it as you go. And then the other thing I took from that book was there was a woman who had done the unthinkable. She had, this was in the 1950s, and she was in Queens, and she walked away from her career altogether to raise her young children. And she wondered every night, like, you know, did I make a fundamental mistake? Will I ever find my way back to a successful career? And she ended up helping a family friend with a campaign. He ended up becoming a very successful politician. She ended up becoming a very successful chief of staff in Washington, right, through her civic work, supporting him. And she says, I wish I had a crystal ball that I could have looked in all those years back, similar to what Dr. Hayes was saying, to tell myself, you will have it all. You will have your family, you will have your personal life, you'll have a successful career. You may not have it all tonight, but you will get there in the big scheme of your life. And so I try to tell myself that to, you know, a kind of just that's a good mantra, right? And so those are some things that have helped me along the way.
And I'll just weigh in a couple of things. So one, I got married as a second-year medical resident to a guy who was already a cardiologist. So he was already had a lot of hours at work, and I had a lot of hours and a cardiology training to go through. And so one of the things, I had my first child when I was a cardiology fellow, and the second as faculty. I did take maternity leave. What I did decide, though, with both of our schedules being 80 hours a week, I decided I would take a day off. And that day was not like a long weekend, it was Wednesday. And I loved having Wednesday off, except when I was in hospital. One, it was the day that once they got in preschool, you could be the mom who could be a reliable volunteer at the preschool class, which was important to me. It was a day, and I had so many friends who said, oh, once they're in grade school, you won't take that day off, or once they're in high school, you won't take that day off. I took that day off until 2010. And the reason I did is because that would then, when my kids didn't need me anymore, that became the day that I could do pursuits, volunteering for some national organizations, being a patient advocate, doing some of the many things. I know Rachel knows I sit on the board of Women Heart, the National Coalition for Women with Heart Disease. And they knew I was off on Wednesday. So they would say, well, we know, do you think if we flew you out Tuesday night, we could have you talk to, you know, give a talk in Washington, D.C. to advocate for us? And so for me, that really worked. Now you have to acknowledge, particularly in academic medicine, that's going to set you back a little bit, because if you're only working 4 days a week, but that plus really trying to practice the mindful no, as opposed to the mindless yes, was very important, because it's so easy, because we're pleasers, it's so easy to say yes, because sometimes it's hard to say no to that person, and sometimes it's just easier to say yes and explain why you don't want to do that thing. And I've gotten myself really dug into doing things I could care less about. Speaking to people or getting on a plane to go someplace, not Arizona tomorrow, by the way. That is something I really want to do, Rachel. But I think that being able to prioritize, and Dr. Chester gave us a great one rubric, but there's many ways to set your priorities and what are non-negotiables for you, or what are your goals, and then making decisions, even the little ones, like will you volunteer in your kid's school next week, that fit with that, whatever it is, because it's different for all of us. And I learned very much the hard way in some of those things, but that's how I managed to get through. And my daughter, who said she would never be a doctor and would never marry a doctor, is a clinical psychologist married to a surgeon. So it couldn't have been that bad.
It looks like we do have a question, because I loved that. I love the statement that you said, Dr. Hayes, regarding a mindful no as opposed to a mindless yes. And it looks like in the chat, there's a question: what happens when your mindful no comes with much resistance from management?
Well, so make some rules about your no's and yeses. So some of the rules that I made that were helpful to me were, does it advance my career? Does it advance my family? Because I knew what was important to me. Or does it bring me joy? Or is it just really important to somebody that I care about, or who cares about me? So that may be management. I don't know what management means in this situation, but because you can't shirk your job. You can't say, I'm not going to do my job. On the other hand, one of the advice I give, particularly to younger women about saying no, is saying not now. Because sometimes the ask comes at a time that it may be something you actually would really like to do, but not now. And so communicating the fact that I'm not saying no to you, it is because I have said yes to this other thing that I am an accountable person and must complete. And because, let's say the last thing you want to do is not deliver, say yes to something, because it's easy to say yes and not deliver it. And so I think there's ways around it, and particularly if what you are being asked to do, maybe it's a developmental opportunity, but it really comes at a super bad time for you, family-wise or professionally, to say, can you ask me for the next cohort next year? Because I'd really like it, but right now. I think the other way to frame that mindful no is when you say the mindless yes, you are by default saying no to something else. There are only 24 hours in the day, or 160 hours in a week. And so what you're giving up is sleep or time with your family. And so that's another way that helps you say that no. So anyway, I think you can get around even with somebody who is trying to be nice and give you an opportunity or wants you to do something, but being able to say what you're doing instead.
And I think just to add to that, sometimes your male counterpart in the practice saying no is not perceived in the same way as a female saying no to the same task. And that perception, to Dr. Hayes' point, and how you word it, I think women have to be, I don't know, we have to be a little bit more decisive about how we speak to that and how we answer that. So I think that varies also academia to private practice. So I think it's an important point, but I think it has to be crafted in such a way sometimes. I think Dr. Barry Mertz spoke to this at one of the first sessions ever, and it was that, we kind of have to frame it differently. Why do we have to do that? But we do, and sometimes. And Juliet, I'm sure you've had clients that have spoke to this in the past, but it is the way it is.
I think the other tendency that a lot of women have is to fill the void. So say you're sitting around the board table and somebody says, well, this task needs to be done, this task force, this whatever, and everybody's silent. And the woman in the room is often the one who said, I'll do it. So it's not even that you're asked. And I think that really holding that back, often that is how we are socialized. And what it means sometimes is we end up often doing the non-recognized, the non-promotable, or the office housework, which sometimes really is housework, like planning the Christmas party, but sometimes it means sitting on the lower level committees, the ones that don't get in front of leadership. And I think being mindful about those things, because men have no problem saying no to those things. They don't feel guilt. They don't feel like, oh, nobody's raising their hand, I better. They don't feel that way. And I think we need to get better at that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
I think that the one thing I would say too is I think as women, we feel the need to give an explanation with even when we don't need to, right? No is a complete sentence. It has taken me many years and lots of therapy to say that. And it's a mantra I repeat. No is a complete sentence. And so I think, when somebody, for me as a young lawyer, is very similar to the resistance that you're describing getting from management. I remember I was closing on my first condo and the partner wanted me to stay late to do a client meeting. And I was like, I'm sorry, I can't tonight. I've got to go sign documents. I didn't need to tell him I needed to sign documents. I should have just said, I'm sorry, I'm not available. I have another commitment. I have another meeting. It didn't matter what it was. And a man probably wouldn't have said where he was going. He would have just said, I can't do it tonight. I'll be there tomorrow. And so I think, to your point, we fill the void, we say too much. We need to reframe it with just being really firm, and less can be more. And then the other thing I would say, and I've been hearing this a lot, and I don't know if you guys have heard it too, I think it's a popular phrase going around, but I like it, is that there's glass balls and then there's plastic balls. And at some point in your life, if not every day, when you have young children and you're trying to have a meaningful career, you're going to have a really hard time keeping all the balls up in the air, and you're going to have to drop some. And that's just the reality that none of us want to hear and none of us want to admit, but it's the truth. Put the plastic balls down or let the plastic ones fall. And so to Dr. Chester's point, right, what is non-negotiable? The glass balls. You're not going to drop picking up your kids from school. You're not going to drop, for me, at a court appearance, for you guys, a surgery or a procedure with a patient. But maybe there's a plastic ball that is planning a Christmas party or sitting on a junior board or doing something that you can say, I can't carry that one today. Ask me again next week or next year.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. That's a great point. And I think lastly, perhaps we'll just say that the pressure doesn't always come from your colleagues. Sometimes your patients have these ridiculous expectations. I know I'm in solo practice, and I was reading echoes up until the day I was in labor. And, and then essentially you forego 3 to 4 months of the practice, and it is what it is because your child comes first and you have to put yourself first. And patients have to understand. Some patients don't, and they will leave the practice because they think that you're not a human being, but you are a human being. You have a life. You also have family members you have to take care of. Some of us have elderly parents and family members and other commitments too. So I think I have to remind myself that you are human and you can only do so much, and that you have achieved a lot. And to the women that are, obviously all of you amazing speakers, and to the women and men that have been present on this webinar, you are amazing in your own right. And we should not respond to pressures and not be reactive, but instead listen to all these amazing tips that we've gotten tonight. Dr. Bond, I'll maybe turn it over to you to close. And I think, should we go?
Yeah, we do have one last question. I just in the interest of everyone's time, but it's a really important question, because how do you respond when your assertiveness is perceived as being aggressive? And I don't know if Dr. Hayes, perhaps you would like to take that question to kind of close us off tonight.
I would just say that it is reality and it is not fair. So I think we just should say that is going to happen to those of us, particularly because cardiology, law are not considered women's professions. And so when we come, and if you are a woman of color, it will be even more so. And so the first is just to gird ourselves and realize that we should not take it personally. I think there's a couple of things. One, trying to, where it is appropriate, is not in the moment to point it out and try to change the culture. That would be me coming from the sort of leader role, is if that is a pervasive thing, if we're really treating women when they push back, or when they raise their hand and say, I volunteer for this like amazing thing, that I'm being aggressive about it. I think the other is we have to walk this tightrope and recognize that we do. I will just say that when I was early in my career, I did not think I was aggressive. I thought I was assertive, and the way I was treated with the nursing staff was like I was a bee. And I would see my colleagues, this is back in the days of the paper charts, I would see a colleague in the hospital or another resident throw down a chart and bark at a nurse and tell her what to do. And she'd say, yes, doctor. And I would have to get the same reaction. Hey, by the way, how's your kid? How's your day going? Could you please, if you would? And I think that's ridiculous that we still have to do this. But I also think we want to be successful and effective. So finding your own voice and way to come off so you don't feel compromised yourself. It's not fair, but if you are consistently being viewed as abrasive, aggressive, you will not be successful in that environment. And so you either find a different environment that is more welcoming to women, or you modify your behavior to the point that you are comfortable, that you find your voice in a different way. I see our lawyer nodding, and I imagine she's had to do the same thing.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, the similarities. I feel like we should collaborate on a panel just on this topic, because same exact, I mean, different charts, clients, not patients, but I can't even tell you the number of depositions and meetings I've been in with male counterpoints, especially my seniors, the people that I trained under, and the difference between the men and the women. And it's the same thing, a female attorney, bending over backwards with legal staff, asking them, could you, can you please, that's a great shirt. I love what you're wearing. How's your kid? Where'd you go on your trip? If you wouldn't mind, could you please do this for me? And as opposed to just it being thrown down and barked at, and the respect, the implicit respect, right? But I think what you said was genius, finding your voice. I think you can be firm, but also do it in a way that you're kind, and you're professional, and you're calm. And so you're not saying, absolutely not, this is unacceptable, this isn't fair. You're not outraged. You're just calmly saying, I'm not available to take that right now, but I'm happy to work on the next project that comes up. You're not saying, you're not being rude, you're not being aggressive. And you have to, I think, to Dr. Hayes's point, find your rhythm with the people in your team. But I think if you're consistently professional and kind, you will have a reputation that people will never be able to say, oh, she is emotional, she's aggressive, she's a loose cannon, right? So we almost have to overcompensate, unfortunately. But I think if you're consistently kind and calm, but professional, but no means no, even though you say it in a nice way, you'll start to garner respect and hopefully be able to set some boundaries.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a really wonderful way to close things off. Just understanding that balance is something that we all have to grapple with. But I think the most important thing is understanding that we don't want you to lose your voice. We just want you to find that proper voice depending on the situation. So I just want to thank all of our wonderful speakers, including Dr. Hayes, Dr. Chester, and Dr. Burgess as well. Both Dr. Desai and I are so fortunate to have all of you all that attended and still stayed on for the duration of our Q&A. We would love to give you back your evening, and we look forward to doing this again next year, hopefully in person. Have a great one.
Nice to meet everybody.
Nice to meet you.